Morning, everyone. My name is Martin Daly. I'm the Director of Water Quality Programs for the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. And welcome to today's webinar. This is part of our CDRPC Local Government Workshop webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about applications of GIS for municipal infrastructure planning and water resource protection. For those of you who do not know us, CDRPC is a regional planning and resource center that serves Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties. We foster intergovernmental cooperation, communicating, collaborating, and facilitating regional initiatives. We work with partners to help them address regional problems. We have historically organized 2 annual day-long workshops to provide training to planning and zoning board members, code enforcement officers, elected officials, and planning professionals. Planning and zoning board of appeals members are required by state statute to obtain 4 hours of training per year. Town, village, and city zoning board of appeals planning members, as well as county board members, must receive this training. In light of New York pause and the restrictions that were imposed in an effort to combat the spread of COVID-19, we had canceled our spring workshop, an event that had traditionally provided a full day's credit to board members. And recognizing that municipalities still need training outlets, we organized these webinars so participants could get their credits that they need. Municipalities have a wide latitude in defining what training is acceptable for credit. And after each webinar in the series, each attendee that registered with an email address will receive an email confirming attendance at today's event. And that email may be submitted to your municipality for consideration of credit. So either your town or city clerk or the chair of the board in which you serve. In addition, for those of us who are practicing AICP certified planners, we submitted this session for 1 hour of CM credit to the. So you're able to go into their website, log in, search up the name of the session, and get your hour for that. Now, as I mentioned, today's webinar topic is CDRPC Local Government Workshop webinar on the application of GIS for municipal infrastructure planning and water resource protection. I want to thank Chazan specifically for sponsoring this webinar and their efforts to bring their expertise to you today. It's very important that we have partners like this that are able to provide the content and support so we can put these events together. A few housekeeping notes. Our attendees join with audio and video muted for security purposes, but this does not mean that you are unable to ask questions or participate. Just please do so using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. For those of you that are familiar with Zoom, it's a little bubble window that you click and allows you to punch in a chat question. I'll be moderating, much like a radio DJ, intercepting calls, if you will, and I'll relay those questions from time to time to our presenters to make sure they get answered. We do archive the presentations on our website, and we also record it. And the links to those materials will be on the cdrpc.org website. And post-event, when you get the email, there'll be a link in your email to access the website. So in case you missed something, you want to go back, you want to view the recording, we do archive all that material. So let's get to it. Geographic Information Systems, or GIS systems, are widely used by the planning community throughout the capital region to inventory critical infrastructure, monitor land use changes, and mitigate water quality related impacts. This webinar highlights examples from communities using smart cities approach to mapping and monitoring municipal sewer, water, and stormwater infrastructure in order to allocate resources, staff, and for capital planning. This webinar will also explore how communities are using GIS to map where the private sewer systems may have a potential impact on nearby water sources. Lastly, it will examine how GIS is being used for modeling potential stormwater quality issues at the watershed scale and identify potential mitigation strategies. We are joined today by Paul Cummings and Ethan Gaddy of Chazan. Mr. Cummings has a professional background focused on community and environmental planning, public participation, and data analysis techniques. He has led and performed a wide variety of planning and development projects ranging from comprehensive natural resource and transportation planning to community revitalization and economic development initiatives. Mr. Cummings is experienced with many funding programs and project implementation strategies. He's also well-versed in land use law and the environmental review process. He's skilled at public participation, skilled as I am at reading his bio, and using more skilled than I am at reading this bio, and using several mapping, visualization, and data management techniques, including GIS systems. He's an AICP and LEED AP certified planner and has trained at the National Charrette Institute. Mr. Gaddy has a master's degree in regional planning from the University of Albany at SUNY, and a strong framework of experience in community planning, land use zoning studies, and natural resource protection. He has broad capabilities in the use of GIS and other technical tools utilized in planning and analysis. He's led and conducted GIS collector training for municipal staff, New York State OGS, and presented to New York State DEC staff regarding cloud-based GIS for utility mapping. Mr. Gaddy is knowledgeable in funding and grant writing, and is experienced with various regional and state programs. With that, you've heard enough from me, and I'm happy to be able to turn it over to Paul and Ethan to bring you through today's webinar. So give me just a moment. I'm going to hit stop screen. I'm going to start my screen share if I can get Zoom to cooperate with me. So many buttons. But I want to thank them for their time. And while I'm messing with this, I will hand it over to Ethan.
Great. Well, Martin, thank you. This is actually Paul. I'll kick it off here.
Okay.
And Ethan's going to share his screen for now. I just want to say thank you, Martin, yourself, and then the CDRPC for hosting these events. I don't know if everyone who's on the call has gotten a chance to, or on the webinar, gotten a chance to participate in these events, and they've always been great, and all the events have been great. But I think during this particular time of everything we're facing, it's just that much more added value to bring us all together. And so we're really appreciative of the forum and having us here. The bios are pretty embarrassing. Our marketing department crafts those, so when you read them, I just, I wish we wouldn't do those. You can just skip that and just say our names next time. How about that, Martin? Next time. That's right. If there is a next time, if we don't botch it. So, as Martin said, we want to speak to you today about the use of GIS, and I'm going to assume there's probably some people on this call that know way more than Ethan and I when it comes to GIS. And I'm going to assume there's people on this call that know maybe not as much or are interested. So we really tried to tailor this presentation about that. For those of you who are heavy users or you've heard of it, I think sometimes you get a sense that GIS is, sort of this one function. It makes a map. Maybe it's your county GIS mapping parcel data viewer. And I think we've become accustomed to that being used as a basis of analysis for some basic analysis, I should say, in planning. But it is a technology that keeps evolving, and equally important is other disciplines are starting to see value in that, where they may have either poo-pooed it outright or the technology didn't interface well. That's all changing. Heavy CAD users are integrating GIS, survey, et cetera. And so as these systems are able to communicate with one another, and then they become more user-friendly and cloud-based, they're really presenting a range of opportunities from lay people to heavy tech users. And so, I put Ethan and I probably in the middle of that pack. And so hopefully we come to you from that perspective that, hey, this doesn't have to be a tool or technology that isn't approachable if you're not a heavy tech user. And then if you're a heavy user, I'd like to apologize first, and feel free to in the chat function correct us on any of the terminology or technology. So you've heard enough about us. Today, we want to talk to you just quickly for those people who aren't as familiar. What is GIS? Well, that'll be very brief. And then Ethan will speak to you about this GIS collector function. So collector is sort of a proprietary term for Esri, which is one of the biggest GIS developers. That said, there are other tools out there and software, but we do use reference collector in this presentation. And Ethan's going to speak to how communities using that for mapping and inventorying and doing field work related to their stormwater and municipal infrastructure. I want to speak to you about GIS being used for what we refer to as site suitability analysis, and using that tool to identify hot spots or priority spots when it comes to on-lot septic systems, which are traditionally a hard thing for any community to manage because by their very nature, they're sort of singular on private property for the most part. And if you're not in an urbanized area that's got municipal sewer and water, this is a pretty significant issue. And we do a lot of work with a lot of rural communities that have sensitive environmental resources. So we'll speak to that. And then last but not least, we want to talk about some really basic big picture stuff that's going on in GIS in terms of trying to manage stormwater management at a watershed scale. And I think the message overall with all these themes that we want to take away for you to take away is that GIS is a great tool to start breaking down what seem like really daunting big picture tasks and organize them in a way, both staff, technology, programmatically, whatever it may be, into manageable projects, and that's really one of the bigger takeaways here. So with that, we'll go to the next slide here, Ethan. So GIS just basically is, if you're not that familiar with it, you've probably experienced it. You've at least used a county GIS website, perhaps. It's merging tabular data, so Excel spreadsheet or Microsoft Access, with what we would call either vector data or raster data. And what that is hey, it's a box that represents a parcel, it's a line that represents a road, or it might be a series of pixels that have embedded in it things like elevation or slopes. Or GIS can calculate those things with certain information. And what it does is it really allows for things to be layered, so road layers, parcel layers, to be analyzed, and they're spatially next to one another, as well as the data, their underlying data, whether it be road condition or road condition near certain land uses, census data. And then there's a wide range of more robust technology that we, obviously could be a whole separate presentation. And I think some of the power of it's going to play out in this presentation. But I think, simply put, if you go to the next slide, Ethan, it really is about going from, what would have been a CAD-based map. So if anyone's on this webinar that's been looking at parcel data for a long time, going from those old tax parcel map or a CAD file for a site, and moving to dynamic, usable, shareable, editable GIS layer that on the right here, all these layers could be queried and analyzed and looked at spatially and can be shared on multiple platforms and become a living document. And that's really important. And we'll talk more, Ethan in particular next, we'll be talking more about that. And so, what we hope to share with you is just how much this technology can be used for a number of different applications. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Ethan to talk about the first topic.
Cool, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so as Paul alluded to, the technology is changing pretty quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about cloud-based GIS applications. A couple things have changed in the past decade or so that have really enabled people to use GIS all over the place. Cloud-based storage is huge. We can send massive amounts of data wirelessly. Then also the use of smartphones and tablets. Everyone has a really powerful computer in their pocket at this point, and we're able to use this technology everywhere now. So this is really having big implications on GIS. So in the past, it was all your GIS was stored somewhere on a server, and you'd have to access that at your desktop, do your analysis there, and then print out a map or have a static PDF version of that. Now, these mobile applications, Esri's Collector app, allows you to actually have an interface with that on your phone. So you can query data, you can organize data, you can update data right on an app on your phone. And you're speaking directly to your really powerful geodatabase that's in the cloud as opposed to on your server. These apps are really cool. They have excellent out-of-the-box functionality. It's a free app. You can start playing around with it, figure out how to use it in about 20 minutes. It makes data entry really easy. You can use drop downs for standardized forms. It works across various devices. You don't need to have specialized hardware for this anymore. It's not proprietary. And then it's all done on the cloud. So all the updates that you need to make on what would be a desktop version, it's sort of a tedious process and licensing and fees. It's all free. And this graphic on the bottom illustrates what we're trying to do. So the workflow in the past previously is you have these really technical specialists going out collecting data, gets post-processed back at the office. From there, you have a map that's produced, somebody else makes decisions about that map, and then in the final image, you'll see the guys that are down in the ditch actually doing the work. So in the past, you'd have a static map where these guys are like, nuts, something changed. We got to go back, redo the map, make new decisions, and then, restart the whole process. Whereas now these guys can make decisions in real time. And not only that, they're also collecting data while they're out there. You can find a lot of things when you're out in the ditch looking at infrastructure. This collector app allows these guys to populate a database about the infrastructure that they're looking at. So the first community that we really use this technology in is Lake George Village. This is really Personally, it's a very special spot for both Paul and I. So anytime we can work on things like water quality there, we jump at the opportunity. So Lake George Village is a good case study because it's an MS4 community. They have to do annual reporting and mapping. They have aging infrastructure, an 85-year-old wastewater treatment plant that is failing, potentially jeopardizing water quality, and they have a very sensitive environmental setting. You know, Lake George is drinking water, and it serves as both a recreational and economic asset to have clean water there. And then also, they have an extremely small tax base, despite the fact that they have hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. There's only about 900 or so year-round residents. So in order to manage this infrastructure that hosts all these people, they have to be very smart about what investments they make and how they manage it. So the way we approach this project of launching the collector, so we'd have this interactive cloud-based application for accessing data about the village, was that we got all of the record mapping that we could find for the village. And this included old paper maps, old CAD files, products from other consultants, just tons of information, and we compiled it into one geodatabase, or just database. So once we had all that information in one place, we actually had to, we worked with the staff to figure out what they need. Who are the people that are doing the day-to-day work? Who are the department heads? What are they looking for? What do they need to know? What are they reporting on? And that helped us develop a data dictionary. A data dictionary is this big master file of all the different attributes and types of information that they would be collecting and reporting. It takes a bit of time to get this step right, and anyone that's thinking about starting one of these projects, definitely do some front-end work before just trying to launch it. We've learned that through trial and error. And then it involved a bit of hands-on training and testing. You got to make sure that everyone that's on these crews understands how to use the technology. It's again very simple, these applications, and then launching and managing the mapping. The management aspect is another thing I would recommend you don't overlook. Doing a one-off collector project in which you, let's just say, inventory the number of signs in a community at one point in time. That's all well and good, but if you're doing this year after year after year, you have to think about how you're going to manage that data, and you do need to have some degree of aptitude with the program if you want to do this on a long-term basis. So the end result of this was, you can see this map on the left of the screen, is all of their infrastructure data in one place that can be queried and updated. The result of this is that we have streamlined data entry and connectivity. So now someone can go out in the field, inspect a manhole, and immediately put that information into the geodatabase. It's on the cloud, and it can be viewed even in the office in real time. It's also reduced a lot of the post-processing that we used to have to be done especially for MS4 reporting. When someone would go out with paper maps, they would take their notes, and then they'd spend probably about twice as much time in the office putting that into an Excel file or putting it back into a map. That step is essentially gone, and that's saving a lot of money and time. Using this technology has reduced the amount of hardware that people need to have, so that's an expense and just a logistic issue. In the past, it would be, all right, take a camera, take a GPS unit so you can get your location, and then take a tablet or a laptop or a notepad. Now you can just do it with one device. We've actually had an incident where one of our engineers dropped a camera in a sewer, a sanitary sewer. They were not getting that camera back. And that cost thousands of dollars of equipment and time. The ability to take photos with the Collector app is something that is immensely powerful. In the past, if anyone has been using GIS on a regular basis, they realize you can get a lot of information about a location, but using photos in GIS is a nightmare. Now with the Collector app, you can take a photo of a feature that you're inspecting or maintaining, and it is geotagged to that location. Anytime you want to access it, you can quickly pull up the photo. This has proven to be one of the most powerful functions that our engineers and field staff love the most. we had a project in the village of Portchester where we inventoried 10,000 individual buildings to figure out their condition and what their use was. And we had 2 photos of each of these properties. And the logistics of trying to manage that on a server would have been a nightmare. I don't know how many folders it would have taken or even how to do it without this program. Then also, this allows people to have back office support and real-time feedback. So for example, if you have someone going out to look at a hydrant and they're like, oh, who owns this property? Someone from the office can actually be monitoring where they are and then pushing data sets into their map. Very, very useful. For example, we had instance where someone was going to check flow reading on water. They went out, found the manhole, but except the manhole had a big truck parked on it. So it's like, what are you going to do? They were able, in the course of about 5 to 10 minutes, figure out upstream and downstream locations of the manholes in that system, and then get all the data they needed just by sort of doing this creative workaround that was only enabled with this dynamic GIS. So the big takeaway with this is that even in a small community like Lake George Village, they've managed to take what used to be a paper static map, put it all into one place. They can quickly populate data, they can access data, and it's making decisions a lot faster. It's saving time on record keeping, and it's saving time on inspection. So it's cost saving, it's efficient, and people are also having fun with it. But so that's Lake George Village. I'll turn it over to Paul here.
Great, thanks, Ethan. And I'll add to that last slide that, what's of value is if you do have GIS and you have this platform as well, the data you're gathering, you're still empowered to do that sort of higher level technical analysis. So, for example, if you are cataloging conditions for fire hydrants or doing hydrant flow testing year over year, that doesn't stay static. That's something you can collect and then aggregate system total, the total system, and then analyze what's the performance year over year and find where there's, if it's a hydrant flow testing, for example, are there issues with pressure in select areas? Maybe it's a particular street that has an aged hydrants or neighborhood, and you can highlight those condition issues and target a day's worth of work, whereas before it would have just been anecdotal or driving around. So there's just a host of other things. With respect to the fee, I do think it's important to clarify there are some, if you have GIS, there's certain free access to get ARC online. That's not a cost prohibitive price without having to buy the whole GIS package. The apps, as Ethan suggested, are free, but there are certainly sometimes those upfront costs. But there's a wide range depending on how broad of an application or how in depth of an application you want to use. You can really tailor your sort of expenses to the project you want to do. So, but thanks again, Ethan. That was great. Sticking with Lake George, again, as Ethan and I have a personal interest and we're fortunate enough to be working up this way quite often, I want to talk to you a little bit about this idea of a site suitability analysis tool, and in particular using it for on-lot septic systems. Lake George, is a large, watershed. It's multiple municipalities, and the town of Lake George is hoping to create a model that can be emulated in the Lake George watershed and certainly elsewhere in terms of how to manage and identify priority issues when it comes to on-lot septic systems, which is very complicated. It's one lake, but it is all these multiple municipalities. So anytime a community embarks on something and is thinking broadly from a watershed perspective, that's very helpful. Other communities are taking note, and other communities are going a different approach with some regulations up front, which is working well too. So there's obviously a lot of coordination up here, both required from a regulatory standpoint, but also on their own accord, recognizing the value, the intrinsic value and economic value of the lake. Next slide. And so why is thinking about on-lot septic systems important? Again, if you're a more rural community, don't have municipal or some sort of centralized water and sewer service, you look at these red dots, they may be a little hard to see, are all the existing housing that's in the Lake George watershed as of 2015. We did this project here with the Lake George Association and mapping the build-out analysis and existing housing and various trends. And so you can see over the last, particularly the last 10 years or 20 years or so, there's been a lot of housing development that's happening in the watershed that's dispersed mostly on-lot septic systems. And then it's projected that there could be more. And just next There you go. And, you know, the yellow dots here represent at full build out what could be built there. And again, those could be primarily on lot septic systems. And so the town of Lake George is worried about that. In addition to improving their existing infrastructure system in conjunction with the Lake George, the village of Lake George, as Ethan pointed out. Next slide. They really want to look at on-lot septic systems. And there's a lot of concerns here. You know, you've probably heard in the news, the concern about harmful algal blooms. The state's, you know, put a lot of funding into examining particularly 12 lakes, Lake George being one of them, to try and identify why, you know, why is that happening? But there are other water quality related issues and human health concerns when it comes to failed on-lot septic systems. And so the town of Lake George, in partnership with the Fund for Lake George, helped to do or develop this on-lot wastewater treatment system modeling that I'm going to explain to you. Now, before I go, I do want to explain what is on-lot for those people who don't understand what that is. But basically, if you're in a home that's not on a centralized system or a commercial business, you flush your toilet or run your sink, and that goes into a system that helps settle the solids that go through a biodegrading process, hopefully natural, and you're not putting certain contaminants down there, and then some sort of distribution field that then allows that water to percolate through an amended soil and layer that then filters that system. And that's in a best case scenario. That's if you're maintaining it well, it was designed well. Well, around the lake, you know, as anywhere, these older homes, you know, may not have that high engineered system, if you will, that was recently built. And quite often it might just be a cesspool, like you see in the upper right-hand photo, which is a pipe going into a pit in the ground. Or people may not know where their system is and they're not cleaning them out, you know, so there's a number of issues. So the question for the town became where to begin. Where do we start? How do we identify where we want to prioritize? And so they started with the notion that, hey, within 500 feet of the lake and 100 feet of its tributaries. And how can we use GIS to then go identify where that is and then model where we should be prioritizing? Next slide. So using GIS, the town and the fund.
Paul?
Yes.
If I could, this is Martin, just a general question. If you could, why did the town decide upon the 500 and 100 foot buffers for their for this project?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I really wish I had you know, Chris Novinsky on the phone. He's a PE with the Fund for Lake George, and I think the assumption there was that that, you know, just given some of the natural existing bedrock conditions, for example, and a few other things, that 500 feet was at least a safe buffer zone to at least where that even if you have a failed on-lot septic system that where you don't have really high densities, that you know, at least there might be some natural mitigation that can occur. So that was the sort of 500 foot choice, if you will. You know, certainly we could have modified it and spent a lot of time, more time picking what that is, or you know, or certain criteria. And then the 100 foot, you know, that's something that has been used by, you know, hydrologists and ecologists as a, sort of a maximum threshold. I think I've seen it personally in watershed planning. It's sort of really the peak threshold setback from a stream corridor when you start looking at, you know, maintaining riparian buffer and not having development. So I think that was just, and then it coincides with some of the stream regulations rather that the Park Commission was looking at. So that was sort of some of the background.
Thanks for going into that. I think it's important to look at when you're looking, because a number of communities might be looking at establishing stream buffers or.
Yeah. It's interesting. So just very briefly, you know, it's interesting. The Park Commission is moving forward with a 35 or 40 foot buffer with other criteria. That's simplifying. And they found that, hey, they can achieve when it comes to stormwater. I'm speaking specifically, so I don't want to speak, you know, there's a lot of different geology characteristics and soil characteristics that can affect on-lot systems. But when it comes to stormwater, you know, you might achieve a high percentage of value within that 35 to 40 feet. And then as you move back, the percent goes down. So that's another thing that was taken into consideration at that time. So, and then plus it was just a manageable scale of the project. So, and that's a good segue back to the slide, is that, you know, it still flagged a number of properties. So we broke it up into 4 phases. We flagged all those properties that were within that buffer. Next slide. And this is where you got to pull up the sleeves, and GIS couldn't solve for all this next step, which really required a pretty rigorous inventory of existing properties, which involved for each of the phases, sending out a survey to property owners, asking them about what year is your system? Do you know where it's located? Was it stamped by an engineer? Have you had it cleaned out? A number of questions. For those who replied in full, that was great. For those who either didn't reply or didn't know certain characteristics, it really was interns and staff and ourselves looking at property class codes and old building permits, and the idea was to come up with a ranking system. A score that one reflected poor. It's all right. Poor conditions and positive conditions, and then unknowns. And so it was a ranking. Say for example, 10 being it's great, it's brand new, and a 1 or 0 meaning hey, this is no good. Next slide. And so back to maybe some part of GIS you're familiar with, we were able to take that data set once it was complete for each of the phases. And you'll see here, this is the parcel data in terms of how it's represented, the boundaries, and on the right is the underlying parcel data information itself, the property key code, owner, all those things. And we were able to join the table that I showed on the previous page, and if you keep clicking through here, Ethan, we're able to join the inventory we created with that parcel data set using, keep clicking through, that parcel ID number. So we had this unique identifier, and that created a really powerful data set. So we had what was the existing conditions of on-lot septic systems as best we could from files and surveys in one database. So we put that on the side for a minute, and we said, okay, well, let's ask the next question. If we were going to start brand new, where would we want to build on-lot septic systems in the first place, given all the new regulations and best practices? And conversely, where would we not want to build? And so we created this table here. It wasn't the final table, but pretty much close to the final, where we created a weighted table for different characteristics that were really important for good or bad on-lot septic systems. So things like steep slopes, permeability, that's a KSAT's the new fancy term for that. We looked at buffers from the shoreline. They even integrated nearshore algae sampling that then gets post-processed to see if certain algae are likely the result of it's hard to identify whether it's human, but is the result of maybe fecal presence. And so we integrated all these data sets. And if you flip to the next slide, and I had to show this just to make it look fancy, this is what a model looks like. It wasn't the final model we used. We ended up breaking up into a couple of phases, but you take that previous slide that we showed there, all those data sets, all the variables, all the information that we collected, and we end up along with that parcel data and survey of properties. And if you go to the next slide, and you get an example that ends in the result, or a product that looks like this. On the left-hand side is the result of that site suitability analysis. It's showing where, greener colors are where there are positive, more favorable conditions for an on-lot septic system. And then, as you get closer to red, it's less positive. And, interestingly, where human development wants to build right along the waterways and upstream corridors, are often not very good conducive for soil properties and geology for on-lot septic systems. Furthermore, in the next little image there, you see the property score. There are a number of issues. There are some high priority sites. There's some sites that aren't. And then when you put those together, you're able to merge these two data sets, and you can see it paints a really good picture where now we can ask the question, if you want to prioritize your efforts, instead of looking at thousands upon thousands of parcels, you may now be able to narrow it down to hundreds of parcels. And that becomes a different conversation. Now, this isn't the final result either. We actually end up modifying that middle image, because certainly that big giant red parcel, all of it isn't a bad on-lot septic system. We're able to use some remote sensing and aerial image to narrow down where the absorption fields and housing likely is, and then classify that area as being the problematic area. So we're able to make even a more nuanced model as the final part. And so this had a really positive results for the community, because then they had a sense on what to do next. And where they left off as of now is they're now going and reaching back out to these property owners, and they're training staff to do on a volunteer basis if people will allow for investigations of their system. They're also, the Fund for Lake George is working on a program where they may pay for or offset the costs on a needs base for individuals that want to replace that system, and it's financially, cost prohibitive. Now you may think, hey, you live on the lake, you probably can afford it, but there are a lot of legacy property owners, particularly these older, smaller camps, that can't quite afford some of these things, and they want to do what's right, and you can imagine they can be incredibly cost prohibitive. So the town's looking at a wide variety of carrots and sticks, mostly carrots, to try and advance improvement on these on-lot septic systems. But with this information, there's going to be a lot more to come for what they're going to do there. Next slide. So switching gears, but using some of the same GIS software or approaches, we're looking at a watershed scale here. This has to do with stormwater. So we're moving from on-lot septic systems. Here is a little small tributary that really is unnamed that goes into Lake George, just north of Lake George Village. And they were noticing an increased turbidity and a delta forming at the confluence with the lake. And the question became, what do we do here? Do we dredge this? Where's this turbidity coming from? Is it the housing? Is it steep slopes? Are there natural geomorphology that's occurring? And it's a unique and large area. And for those of you, if you're a CAD user, this process should resonate with you and be interesting. They began by thinking, hey, maybe there needs to be some sort of large-scale end-of-the-pipe solution, like an engineered wetland, for example, that's located towards the end of this watershed or something like that. And so the investigation began, okay, what is the boundary of the watershed? You can see that image on the left. What are its subcatchments? Those are the little lines that are in the middle. And then where will we put maybe some large of the end-of-pipe solution? And so in order to map that hydrology, the engineer said, hey, this would be really hard for us to do in CAD, where to hand map or heads up digitize all the conditions in this watershed and then map that in Hydrocad. And so what we did was we used remote sense technology to take higher resolution imagery and reclassify it to show a more accurate land cover, which is the image in the middle. And that's saved a tremendous amount of time and helped, and then delineated those subcatchments in the watershed in the first place, I should add. And then obviously using GIS, we were able to look at slopes and soils, which are other conditions that we use in this model that's on the right, which if you're not familiar with that is Hydrocad. And this is used if you're a private developer to model stormwater. We're using the same technology on a large watershed scale. And what they're able to do is recognize, hey, look, the issue actually may be more subtle. There's a series of pinch points and certain areas of conveyance that really are contributing probably a majority of these issues, the turbidity that we're seeing. If you go to the next slide. And sure enough, as we go and investigate it and conducted the field work, we knew anecdotally these were problems, but we didn't know to what extent. But the modeling really showed that things like open swales, poorly designed catch basins, wing curbs, you name it, culverts, just pipe culverts cause all sorts of problems, and really, and then the treatment practices on the roadway for during the winter months were really probably a bigger culprit than had anticipated. And the good news with that in this research is, if you go to the next slide, it resulted in a much more iterative, cost-effective approach to making these improvements. And while it's not the best graphic on the left-hand side in a static map in CAD, mind you, so we're defeating our message or going against our message, are a series of very site-specific improvements along this stream network and roadway infrastructure that can be done to improve water quality here. And you see some renderings in the middle of some of those treatments. And on the right, I apologize, it's a little hard to read, but it's an overall cost estimate broken out for each one of these phases. The good news is this is something that the community could undertake. They did receive funding in a grant from DEC in support with the LGA, Lake George Association. And currently, as we speak right now, they are out there making all these series of improvements. And there'll be some monitoring activity after that to look at what's going on with that delta. But it's just an example of how what was seeming to be a large-scale project where they're talking about even acquiring property, making a large engineered wetland, going through that permitting process, years of that effort, was something that in a very short order was able to identify and being able to be conducted locally. And so I want to end on one more local example towards the capital region in the town of Stillwater. And this is an ongoing project and we're excited about it. The town of Stillwater, we've had the we're really fortunate. We've been working with them for a number of years, and it's great. We could do a presentation on Stillwater alone. It's not something that you hear about all that much. They're not one to have something in press releases or write about it, but they've been doing a lot of really interesting planning in the town. They've been embarked on and been studying. It's taken a long time to develop a TDR. They have a purchase of development rights program to preserve farmland. They've adopted form-based code in select areas. But through that planning experience, they really became comfortable to approach a topic that they long sort of, I don't want to say dread, but didn't know how to tackle. And that is the Saratoga Lake watershed. And so with their planning experience, they went for a grant to look at along Saratoga Lake. What's interesting, the grant really did start out with, hey, how could 9P, if you're familiar with the area, be improved from a complete streets perspective? I know that was a recent topic you all had. What economic development and lake access opportunities could happen. And then land use and water quality were certainly something that during the writing of the grant and previous planning efforts had spelled out that they wanted to address. But if you go next slide, they realized, hey, through the planning process that they could play a really important role, though, as they heard from the community that water quality was much more important, and really a desire and an appetite by the public to do something about it. They looked at it and said, hey, we might be able to be a model in some ways if we do this right. And if you look, there's Saratoga Lake on the far right side there, and that previous map showed that the watershed for the town of Stillwater, its portion of Saratoga Lake watershed, it's actually quite small when you look at the balance of the watershed for Saratoga Lake, which runs through, city of Saratoga and a number of other communities. So, the town of Stillwater looked at their experience and not just what they would do for themselves, but what others might think about if they want to do, watershed wide. Next slide, please. And so what they realized, and I got to give the town credit, they had public meetings and they started having, 60, 70, 80% turnout from Saratoga Lake residents because they're simultaneously updating a comprehensive plan. And the residents there, to give them credit as well, said, look, we really want to focus much more on water quality. There's all sorts of anecdotal information, evidence rather, that there is water quality issues in the lake. Also, other great organizations are studying this as well, including Skidmore, Slipid, Saratoga Lake Association, et cetera. And they said, we want to do our share. And so what we began with was we had the watershed map, but what we then needed to do was map all the subcatchments. And then we did a similar exercise, some of that Hydrocad modeling we did in our previous example. And here we looked at what type of water quality. I won't pretend that I understand that table in the upper left-hand corner that was prepared by the engineers, but we helped do the GIS analysis to feed their modeling. And what it results in, the color, the darker reds indicate the types of runoff based on their land use, soil properties, slopes, and other conditions that are likely contributing the most to anything, whether it be turbidity, phosphates, nitrates, etc. Whereas the greener colors are less likely. What's of interest, I think if you asked any of us before we did this exercise where we would start, it would have been where the greener covered, more favorable conditions are, because there's actually probably some more housing and some land uses that we would have thought were of issue. They're newer developments, they meet new stormwater practices, and what we found was the red ones actually extended up into the community's agricultural districts. Now, the farmers there are good stewards of their land and they want to take part, and they've taken part in the planning process, but certainly historic practices and some of those agricultural practices and even road maintenance. So to put some of it on the town, I think the supervisor would recognize that as well, is not conducive to good water quality. Open swales, poorly designed culverts, agricultural practices that may not be as favorable. And so it really changed everything on its head where to begin to seek improving water quality conditions in Saratoga Lake. And so it begged the question, what else? So what more information do we need to do, and what steps should we take from a land use perspective? And so from there, the town is looking at now, and this is very close to happening. They are, as I said, updating their comprehensive plan. They're prepared. They're doing it in conjunction with a GEIS update, and they're going to be embarking on new zoning regulations. But the first things they're looking at are adopting, based on this information, the public support and information they've received, is adopting a watershed overlay district that will now have stream corridor, steep slope protections, require conservation-based subdivision. They're looking at changing allowed densities in select areas. Some of that zoning, it may seem a little counterintuitive, lower densities as you move away from the lake. That's in part, they're acknowledging that there are already high densities on the waterfront, but they may lower densities where they can as they move upward. They received 2 grants, one from DEC and DOS to continue their modeling and analysis of that water quality process we just described. And the effort is to identify where, with either private partnerships or on publicly owned lands, can they put diffuse, not necessarily centralized green infrastructure treatments along roadways or new catch basins or engineered wetlands, buffer riparian zones. They're looking to reduce the threshold or improve their stormwater standards and reduce the threshold from the state requirements for what triggers a heightened or enhanced stormwater regulations. That would be very forward thinking for Saratoga Lake community. That's something, for example, up here in Lake George, the Park Commission requires. They're not exactly like Lake George Park Commission standards, so I don't want, if you're from Stillwater, think there's significant regulations coming down the pike, but it is a good first step. And then last but not least, they are going to work with their non-for-profit and partners and educational partners and private communities, so that triple helix, whether it be SLIPID, Saratoga Lake Association, Skidmore, et cetera, to help educate existing landowners, the general public at large, and so that they can play an active role in helping to help people understand what good stewardship is and why the regulations and or other activities they may be taking are being done. And it is about the economic value of the lake. It is about being good stewards of the lake. It is about water quality, and it is really for all the right reasons. And so with that, I think, Ethan, we've got through, and our goal is to leave enough time for questions. We recognize, everyone has limited time in the day, and so we're happy to, and we're prepared to go through and speak more about how these tools are used in any given project.
So with that, I just want to remind folks that the chat function's available if they do have questions. We did get a note from Elena Millette, who noted that the New York State Tug Hill Commission, for anyone working out there, offers a mobile data collection app through their GIS cloud account, and they make that available to the 62 municipalities within the Tug Hill region. So if folks are dialing in from that area of the state, certainly reach out to the Tug Hill Commission for some assistance there. We don't have any more questions, but I do want to note another example of the GIS collector app being used to gather data about the performance of these storm systems is being used for the Stormwater Coalition of Albany County. They're using the system to meet the requirements that are laid out in their MS4 permit. So for folks that are covered, that have permit coverage through the MS4 permit or are expecting to have permit coverage soon after the 2020 census, these programs have been very useful in maintaining compliance. Certainly the things that Paul and Ethan were talking about were addressing on-site issues with water quality, but they're essential for maintaining compliance with the New York State permit regulations. We have a question from Benjamin, who said, excellent presentation. Thank you for those comments, Benjamin. And he asked if we could talk a little bit more about the criteria used in the suitability analysis and how they were weighted. I think that relates back to the to Lake George for the septic suitability.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Slide back that way.
Yeah, Ethan, if you could go to that, I think it was that blue table there that we had. Really good question. One, I think, I need to acknowledge, as a planner, I'm not the engineer. And so when we were creating this site suitability analysis, we worked with, we're fortunate up this way, the non-for-profit community, whether it be an educational community like Darien Freshwater Institute, the Fund for Lake George, citizens that happen to be limnologists, and then our own professional staff. And so using their brain power, if you will, we came up with this criteria. I think, and the criteria, let me start off as, there are certain things that are just regulatory based. So if you're designing on-lot wastewater treatment facilities, I'll give you an example. If you go onto the USDA's web soil data viewer, you'll see there's a criteria where you can map if you're familiar with it, you can go map an area of interest. It can show you all the soil properties, and then there's a number of queries you can ask to see what's suitable for that soil. And for example, one is on-lot wastewater treatment systems, and New York has some unique requirements. And so, you know, we started with those. You know, what are the soil properties? What are the steep slopes? And really, I personally relied on those people who are the engineers in the room that understand the regulations to recognize what aspects of those regulations really play the most significant role in performance of on-lot septic systems. Certainly, the dynamic for in this Lake George experiment that we did was we added this buffer component to it. As I mentioned, we had mapped more specifically where housing and leach fields were, and that was really important because, you know, some of those properties that were coded, these huge areas that were coded poor performers, the house and septic system may not even be in that area. So that buffer really became, you know, mapping one where the leach field is, and then two, is it in the buffer, really became that much more nuanced or accurate, if you can imagine. The things like Palmer and trophic have to do with the algae. We had a sample set, you know, of where they're swimming along the shoreline. We broke up the shoreline into this grid, and then that information, you know, we need to make sure that there were apples to apples, where we were saying, hey, that range of influence could be coming from the stream corridors within that buffer area. For those of you who are familiar with GIS, you wouldn't want to do a site suitability analysis that, hey, one data set is the entire town and the other data set is some portion of the town, and then you weighted them in such a way that it wouldn't make sense to have that big geography of the town in the modeling, because you could throw off the weighting. So we ended up having to clip properties and areas and algae sampling and the assumed upland influence to a fixed data set within those 500 and 100-foot buffers, and then this near shore sampling. And so, you know, again, the weighting, the criteria and the weighting really was left up to those specialists. Again, there was a limnologist involved, a few PEs, and some professors, you know, people input from professors of hydrology. We really benefit here. I don't know if you're familiar in Lake George. We have the Jefferson project, which the fund's involved with, RPI is involved with, and IBM. And so, not that we were able to get any of their data here, but we're just, the brain trust that's around the lake has been very helpful in helping to just make a phone call and ask a few questions. So if you want, there's a very good presentation that the Fund for Lake George put on that I encourage you to look at, called the Septic Summit. It may not seem that interesting, but they had specialists come from all over the country to come and speak to, whether it was people who develop proprietary wastewater on-site treatment systems in environmentally sensitive areas, to environmental specialists that are doing similar exercises elsewhere, and then this exercise was also presented around the lake. And so that's a video series of presentations that you can see on their website.
Well, that's great. If you want to include a slide after this with your, I would imagine, with your contact info and a note about that, that might be useful to folks to be able to not have to memorize that, but
yep.
be able to contact you guys.
Happy to do that.
And that's a really nice, smooth transition for folks that, and I can go back to, if you give me a moment, I will go back to my shared screen. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I think what I'll do is, if I can jump back into my own shared screen, folks will pardon me for a moment. I will show where they can access the link, and they by no means have to memorize this, but let me go to that share screen, and I'm going to do this. Hold on one moment. Excellent. Okay, so folks should see the where we archive all the presentations from not only this session but our prior sessions as well, and we provide opportunities for upcoming sessions as well. So folks are looking for an archive copy of the presentation that Ethan and Paul shared today. That'll be on our website, along with a recording of the webinar as well. We provide a link to our YouTube channel, and I recommend, if folks are interested in accessing that material, Look for CDRPC on YouTube, like and subscribe to that account, and you'll be notified whenever we post a new opportunity for a webinar. We've had some really engaging webinars in the past about natural resource protection, transit-oriented development, about grants and funding opportunities, about what happens if a project gets proposed before your planning and zoning board is modified after its approval process. So I really can't talk about that enough, and the opportunities that that provides. If you do miss a webinar opportunity to be on live, we do archive them. The second note for housekeeping is that link that you're seeing on your screen, that will be in the confirmation email that if you registered with an email address, you will receive. And that email address is something that you can submit to your municipality for consideration of credits. I'm gonna open up my window here and see if we got any more questions. It doesn't look like we did, but if folks do have questions, they can certainly reach out to Paul or Ethan. They'll provide their contact information, I'm hoping on their webinar, and we will archive that on our website shortly. So with that, I want to thank you guys very much for taking the time with us this morning. It was a really engaging presentation. I'll certainly be reaching out to you as we're doing some watershed investigation work with the City of Watervliet and the town of Guilderland. So I learned a lot of great new things, and I'm certainly going to be reaching out to you and picking your brains for some of those resources that you shared today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, very educational. Really appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.